Welcome back to the Relocation Series. I'm Eric Eby, your relocation specialist here in Northwest Arkansas. And in this video, we're going to dive into the most notable areas of an Arkansas residential real estate contract. Understanding this contract is crucial for making informed decisions when purchasing your new home. I'm not going to explain every single line of the contract because that would be the longest and most boring video I could ever make, but I'll cover the most important things that you need to know. It's important for me to say now that I am not an attorney, so if you have more detailed questions about a section, you should reach out to your attorney. So the contract starts out with the buyer's names, the address, and the legal description of the property and the offer price. In Arkansas, we have to specify if you are paying cash or financing, and if you are financing, what type of loan you will be obtaining. Your agent will help you understand the market value of the home and local market conditions to make a competitive offer. The next page only applies if you're getting a government loan like a VA or FHA loan. These paragraphs are forms of buyer protection that basically say if the house doesn't appraise for the contract price, then the buyer isn't obligated to move forward and they will not lose any of their deposit money. Then agency refers to how the buyer and seller are being represented by licensed real estate agents. The selling firm works with the buyer and the listing firm works with the seller. Sometimes the listing agent will work for the same brokerage as the buyer's agent, or the listing agent might represent both the buyer and the seller. This is known as dual agency. Dual agency is legal in Arkansas, but the agent has to be very impartial to both parties during negotiations in order to stay fair to both parties and not cause a conflict of interest. For this reason, it is a good idea to always use a buyer's agent to ensure that your best interests are being represented. Closing costs are an important aspect of every real estate transaction as they will affect the seller's net proceeds and how much money a buyer has to bring to closing. This paragraph is written by default to explain that the seller will pay their own closing costs, but it leaves the buyer closing costs open-ended. In a seller's market or in a multiple offer scenario, you will likely have to pay your own closing costs as the buyer, but in a stable or buyer's market, you might be able to get the seller to cover them for you. Next, the application for financing section states that you have 5 business days from the date the offer is accepted to complete your application with your lender. Now we're going to talk about deposits. There are 2 types of deposits that can be offered to the seller as a show of good faith that you are serious about buying the house and fully intend to live up to the terms of the contract to get to the closing table. Number 1 is earnest money deposits, and the other option is a non-refundable deposits. These are 2 very different things, so let me break them down for you. First, earnest money is to be tendered within 3 business days after the offer has been accepted, and it's held by either the listing or the selling firm or the title company, and it is credited to the buyer at closing. If you look at an earnest money addendum, it outlines when earnest money can be refundable to a buyer, such as if the house doesn't appraise for the contract price, or if the buyer and seller can't come to an agreement on repairs. If the buyer fails to fulfill any of their contractual obligations, then the seller gets to keep the earnest money as liquidated damages and terminate the contract. It's important to note here that earnest money is not very uncommon in Arkansas because the contract is buyer friendly and allows them to get their earnest money back if the house doesn't appraise, if the buyer can't obtain insurance, or if the buyer and seller can't come to an agreement on repairs. Now, non-refundable deposits are way less buyer friendly because they're exactly what they sound like, non-refundable. These can be tendered either within 3 days after the offer is accepted or within 3 days after any repairs are agreed to, and they are paid directly to the seller and credited to the buyer at closing. The only way a non-refundable deposit can be refunded is in the case that the seller fails to fulfill their contractual obligations. These have become more common in Northwest Arkansas over the last 5 years because it puts more skin in the game for the buyer. Conveyance refers to how the transfer of ownership or the deed will convey to the buyer at closing. A general warranty deed guarantees clear title to the property that is free of liens, easements, or other encumbrances, and that no other person has any claim or interest to the property. Next, the title requirements section specifies who is going to pay for the title insurance. Title insurance is an insurance policy that protects the buyer and the seller if an error is made in the title work. Now let's talk about land surveys. Land surveys show the property lines, easements, improvements, and encroachments of a parcel of land. If you're buying a house in a subdivision, you likely won't spend money to show where the property lines are since most yards will be fenced off. But if you're purchasing a property with some acreage, you might want to get a survey done. Now this is a negotiable item that can be paid for by the buyer, the seller, or equally split between both parties. Next, the proration section talks about how things like property taxes and insurance will be prorated based on the closing date on the contract. The seller is responsible for those expenses due prior to the closing date, and the buyer becomes responsible for them on the date of closing. Moving on, the fixtures and attached equipment section discusses what things are considered fixtures on the property and if any of those fixtures are included with the property. Generally, anything that is bolted or screwed into the property is considered a fixture, such as light fixtures, ovens, dishwashers, built-in microwaves, etc. Refrigerators, washers, and dryers are considered personal property and are therefore not considered fixtures and won't automatically convey with the property. These items would have to be negotiated in. Any item can be written into the contract to transfer to the buyer at closing, but it's important to note that lenders don't like seeing a bunch of personal property on a real estate contract, so keep this stuff very limited. The next page discusses other contingencies. The most common other contingency is in regards to a buyer having to sell another property. You will see that there are two subparagraphs here that mention binding with an escape clause or binding without an escape clause. An escape clause benefits the seller in the sense that it allows the seller to continue to show the property and solicit other offers. If they receive an offer they would like to accept, they will give you, the buyer, a written notice which would give you a certain amount of time, usually 24, 48, or 72 hours, to remove your contingency and close within 30 days. Binding without an escape clause would require the seller to take the house off the market and wait for you to get your property under contract, so this is a better situation for a buyer. Next, home warranties offer a buyer an added layer of protection once the property becomes theirs. Home warranties cover major appliances and other things that the homeowner's insurance doesn't cover, like water heaters and the HVAC system. Home warranties can be paid for by the buyer or the seller. Next, we get into inspections. First, I want to state that it is never recommended that you waive your right to an inspection, even on an as-is property. You don't want to lose your right to terminate if you find out that the property is in unsatisfactory condition and the inspection is one of your lifelines in the contract. The inspection is a form of buyer protection that lets the buyer assess the condition of the property. This section continues on the next page and outlines that in Arkansas, the buyer has 10 business days to conduct their inspections. Most buyers will hire a general home inspector and then hire additional specialists as recommended by the general inspection. On or before the 10th business day, your agent will work with you to put together any repair request on the inspection, repair, and survey addendum. The seller will then have 5 business days to respond to your request, taking one of these 4 options. Number 1, they can agree to all of your repairs. 2, they can agree to some of the repairs but say no to others. 3, they can say I'm not going to do any repairs. Or number 4, they can offer you a credit in lieu of repairs and you can take care of those after closing. Now, if the buyer and seller can't agree on how to handle repairs, then both parties can agree to terminate the contract. The next section is talking about the seller property disclosure, which is a form that a seller fills out that lists everything they know about the property, from the basic information like utility companies and school districts to any insurance claims or encroachments on the property. Sellers are required to provide details about anything they answer yes to on this form. Now next, we have termites in Arkansas. So this section explains that the seller is required to provide a buyer with a 1-year termite policy to ensure there are no active termites. It is up to the buyer to keep an active policy after a year, but it's not required. Next, lead-based paints were very common in properties built before 1978, and they're very hazardous. So if a property was built before 1978, the seller will have to complete a lead-based paint addendum stating if they are aware of the presence of any lead-based paint on any surface on the property. The next section discusses homeowners insurance. A buyer has 10 business days from the date the contract is accepted to obtain homeowners insurance. If a buyer is unable to get homeowners insurance on a property due to its condition, then the buyer and seller agree to terminate the contract. Page 12 defines the closing date and specifies how closing will occur. With a conventional loan, you can close in about 30 days or less, and government loans can take up to 45 days. In Northwest Arkansas, there are only a handful of VA certified appraisers, so a VA loan typically takes the longest to close. Then possession refers to when a buyer can start moving in. Usually it's the day of closing once the buyer and seller have both signed their closing documents and the funding has occurred, but there are situations in which delayed or early occupancy can occur, and each of those have specific addendums to define who was responsible for what and for how long, and if there will be any additional charges to the buyer or seller. The next few sections get into bland standard contract legalese, and then the other paragraph is where certain other terms or conditions can be written in. Now these blanks should be used sparingly because once again, most realtors are not licensed attorneys, so you should use this blank wisely. Then there are a few other more legalese sections that I won't bore you with, and then the licensee disclosure, which will disclose to all parties if anyone acting as a buyer or seller holds a valid Arkansas real estate license. And then the last section defines the expiration date and time of your offer. Now I know that was like taking a sip out of a fire hydrant, and some of you are probably asleep. Navigating the Arkansas residential real estate contract can seem complex, but with the right guidance, it becomes manageable. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for the next video where I will discuss what terms you should consider in an offer. Thanks for watching and happy relocating.